name is TJ London, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about Man of War and the Rebels and Redcoat Saga. Before I actually can get into talking about Man of War, I'm just going to give you a little bit of backstory and tell you a little bit about what the saga is all about. And why is it a saga? Why is it not a series? So first of all, saga being ongoing story of the same characters. I'm a huge fan of sagas. So I grew up as a Gen Xer, and I really loved The Bastard and the Rebel. Those were books by John Jakes, and eventually were made into TV series that were these big sweeping historicals. And I loved the fact that it was an ongoing story about the same characters, and that we get to find out what happens to them and their families, and in the backdrop of an amazing historical story. So I really kind of utilized my love for that to create the Rebels and Redcoat Saga. And so it is made up currently of 4 books. And the first 3 books are called The Tory, The Traitor, and The Turncoat. And what those stories are really about, there's 2 things. Well, one, they're about historic time periods. So specifically the American Revolutionary War. I'm a huge fan of the American Revolution. It's every author who writes history has a time period that she really believes she, has been reincarnated from. Like, I've been stolen from the American Revolution into the modern times, right? So my heart is back there, and every author has their time period, but that is mine. So but it's a specific story. So most people know the founding fathers. They know the they know the battles of New York. They know all those important battles of Saratoga. They know about the Minutemen. They know about Boston. They know about Cornwallis. They know about Yorktown. But many people do not know the story of the battles of upstate New York, which would be the Battle of Oriskany and the Battle of Fort Stanwix. And many people do not know the stories about the Six Nations of the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and its involvement with the American Revolutionary War, specifically the Oneida Nation. As I was doing my research for this story and creating this story, I really fell in love with this history that I didn't know. As a student of the American Revolutionary War and someone who loved it and clamored on to anything I could learn about it, I read some very interesting books and found this part of the story that I didn't know, that I didn't learn in school, that no one ever taught me. And I was like, why don't I know this? Why has no one ever taught me this? And actually, I went to the American Revolutionary War Museum that's in Philadelphia, and there's a whole section, dedicated to this part of the story. So I took it upon myself really to try to find everything I could about this story. And it was really going on when I was in counseling. And as a researcher, as I am as an individual, I kind of married the overarching story, my story, what I was going through in counseling, with the backdrop of the battles of upstate New York. And we see in The Tory, The Traitor, and The Turncoat really the build up to the Battle of Oriskany, which was a battle that took place in upstate New York. And it was between basically militia forces and Native American forces. And it's a very pivotal and important battle, not only in terms of the American Revolutionary War, but in terms of what it did to the Six Nations, the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So that's the backdrop of the story. The main part of the story, so the fictional part of the story that I wrote, is about a character named Captain John Carlisle. And unlike most American Revolutionary War stories, he is a redcoat, and he is our hero of this story. Not because I felt like turning a story on its head and doing something different. It was because it made sense in the context of what I was doing. I was writing and counseling, and from his perspective, the story made sense to me as an individual in counseling, and also to the history in the story. So John starts our story in a very dark place, just as I was writing the story. And he has been given a second chance by General Howe to clear his name and potentially gain back his commission as a captain. And he is sent to upstate New York to go undercover. And he does. He goes up there, and while he is there, he meets our heroine, Dallas McKesson. And this is a woman who runs a tavern. Now, to run a tavern during the American Revolutionary War as a woman was a respectable profession. It was one of the few respectable professions you could have as a woman at that time. But not many women do that because they wanted to at that time. And it is exactly the case with Dallas. She's had a very traumatic thing happen in her life, some very traumatic experiences. And it has brought her to this place where she is a single woman who runs a tavern. John Carlisle and his men stay at her tavern. They are undercover. And that is really the start of the story. And we continue and follow John and Dallas through into the traitor and then finally into the turncoat. But the overarching story, again, will lead us up to that moment of the Battle of Oriskany. And finally, the Battle of Fort Stanwix. And I like to weave in the real history along with my story so that at times you're like, where does her start and where does the truth end? And my goal was to really get the reader to think, to question, to ask, but to also experience and to remember that war is timeless in terms of like the experiences that humans have, whether it be today, very timely, or in the past. There are marginalized communities, there are casualties of war, there are prices for war, and there are people who get caught in the middle of other people's battles too. And so I was trying to also show that war is timeless and not in a good way. And that we can look to the past and learn for the future. And so that is what the overarching story, the trilogy, at least the first part of the Rebels and Redcoat saga, is about.
Where does Man of War fit into the Rebels and Redcoat saga?
Man of War is the prequel. It is written forth for a reason. And I did this because there was history I didn't want to give away until later. So if you're a purist, technically you wouldn't read the book until fourth. However, it can be read by itself. It is a standalone. The book is meant to stand by itself. You can read it and maybe you're interested in the rest of the story or maybe you're not. It is a Royal Navy story. It takes place 20 years before the Rebels and Redcoat saga. So that's in 1776. We see the start of the Rebels and Redcoat saga. So this takes place in actually 1755. What happened in 1755? Do you know? Of course not. Most people don't. It was the start of the 7 Years' War, or people often know as the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War actually started on a little island known as Nova Scotia. There was a battle between the Royal Navy and French ships, and it occurred off the coast of Nova Scotia. And that is where we start Man of War. So Man of War takes place there. Why there? Well, there are multiple things happening in that story, but it's really, again, against the backdrop of what was happening in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, excuse me. So this story is really telling us what we're missing in the saga. So why did the brothers have a falling out, the McKesson brothers? How did the Carlisles actually meet the McKessons? And how did they all end up in upstate New York later on in the rest of the Rebels and Redcoat saga? This story, Man of War, tells us how they got there, and it fills in the blanks. Also, how did Dallas's youngest uncle become a duke, right? Like that doesn't make sense at all based on what we know about lineage and heritage and those kinds of things and in titles. But it happened. And how did that happen? And Man of War will answer that question. So Man of War is the prequel, like I said, but it does actually was written forth. And like I said, I did that strategically to kind of hide some information, but it's also geared to set you up for the next part of the rest of the Rebels and Redcoat saga. That's when we step into Alexei McKesson's part of this story. That would be the Rebel, the Raider, and the Renegade, which are all in process now being written. And this book, really, Man of War, sets you up and gets you ready for everything you need to know. So it explains things you were missing in the first part of the story, and it gets you ready to get into Alexei's part of the story. So it's a pivotal moment in the saga. But again, it stands alone, so it can be read by itself. But, and I like to think that it's just as exciting as a standalone as it is in context with the rest of the story. So that is the Rebels and Redcoat saga, and that is Man of War. And I can't wait to tell you about the rest of it.